Right now, as you're watching this video, there are thousands of tiny plastic fragments, smaller than the width of a human hair, circulating through your bloodstream. They're in your lungs, embedded in your organs, and crossing barriers in your body that were supposed to keep foreign invaders out. You didn't choose this. You can't see them, taste them, or feel them. But they're there, and they're doing things to your body that scientists are only just beginning to understand. What I'm about to share with you isn't some distant environmental concern that might affect future generations. This is happening to you right now, today, as we speak. And the more research that emerges, the more terrifying the reality becomes. Because microplastics aren't just an environmental problem anymore. They're a human health crisis that's been hiding in plain sight. What started as curiosity about ocean pollution turned into an obsession when I discovered that the average person consumes about 5 grams of plastic every week. That's equivalent to eating a credit card every single week. But here's what's really unsettling. That 5 grams figure, it's from 2019 and it's already outdated. The latest research suggests we're consuming far more than that. And it's coming from sources you would never suspect. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the shocking truth about microplastics that the plastic industry doesn't want you to know. I'll show you exactly how these particles are infiltrating your body, what they're doing once they get inside, and why the health implications are far more serious than anyone initially realized. I've spent countless hours poring over research papers, tracking down scientists who are studying this crisis, and piecing together a story that's both fascinating and deeply disturbing. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why some researchers are calling microplastics the asbestos of our generation. But first, let me paint you a picture of just how pervasive this problem has become. If you find comfort in these gentle explorations of space and science, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing and giving this video a like. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Feel free to drop your location and time in the comments below. Let's start. Imagine for a moment that you could see microplastics. Picture them as tiny, glowing particles floating through the air around you. You'd watch them drift down from the sky like invisible snow. You'd see them swirling in every glass of water you drink, coating every piece of food you eat. They'd be dancing in the air every time you opened a package, put on synthetic clothing, or drove your car. The world would look like a snow globe that someone just shook, except the snow never settles. That's the reality we're living in. Except these particles are completely invisible to the naked eye. Scientists have found microplastics in literally every environment they've tested, from the deepest ocean trenches to the highest mountain peaks. They're in Arctic ice, desert sand, and rainwater falling in the most remote locations on Earth. They've been discovered in beer, honey, tea bags, and table salt. They're in the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the food we eat. But here's where it gets really personal. In 2022, researchers made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the scientific community. They found microplastics in human placentas. Think about that for a moment. These plastic particles are so small and so pervasive that they're crossing the placental barrier and reaching developing babies before they're even born. We're literally bringing children into this world with plastic already in their systems. And that was just the beginning of a series of discoveries that have redefined what we thought we knew about microplastics and human health. In 2020, scientists found microplastics in human stool samples from people all around the world. In 2021, they discovered them in human lung tissue. In 2022, they found them in human blood for the first time. And in 2023, researchers detected microplastics in human breast milk. meaning mothers are unknowingly passing plastic particles to their nursing infants. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came just last year, when researchers found microplastics embedded deep within human brain tissue. These particles had somehow crossed the blood-brain barrier, one of the most protective barriers in the human body, designed specifically to keep harmful substances out of our most vital organ. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so there are tiny pieces of plastic in our bodies. That sounds bad, but plastic is supposed to be inert, right? It's designed to be stable and not react with other substances. So maybe it's not that big of a deal if there are small amounts floating around inside us. That's exactly what researchers thought initially. But as they've dug deeper into what these particles actually do once they're inside our bodies, they've uncovered a reality that's far more complex and concerning than anyone anticipated. You see, when we talk about microplastics, we're not just talking about tiny pieces of the same plastic that makes up your water bottle or grocery bag. These particles go through a transformation process as they break down in the environment. They absorb chemicals from their surroundings like tiny sponges. They pick up pesticides, heavy metals, persistent organic pollutants, and other toxic substances as they travel through soil, water, and air. So when these particles enter your body, they're not just inert pieces of plastic, they're chemical delivery systems carrying a cocktail of toxic substances directly into your tissues and organs. But that's not even the worst part. The plastic particles themselves can leach chemicals. Many plastics contain additives like phthalates, bisphenol A, flame retardants, and UV stabilizers. These chemicals weren't meant to stay locked within the plastic forever. They were designed to migrate. And when microplastic particles end up in the warm, wet environment of your body, these chemicals start leaching out at accelerated rates. Recent studies have shown that microplastics can act like Trojan horses, delivering hormone-disrupting chemicals directly to your endocrine system. They can interfere with your body's natural hormone production, potentially affecting everything from your reproductive health to your metabolism to your mood. But the story gets even more complicated when you consider the size of these particles. Microplastics are defined as plastic fragments smaller than 5 millimeters. That might sound tiny, but in the world of particles that can interact with your body at the cellular level, 5 millimeters is actually enormous. The particles that scientists are most concerned about are the nanoplastics. These are plastic fragments smaller than 1 micrometer, thousands of times smaller than the width of a human hair. At this size, plastic particles can penetrate cell membranes, cross tissue barriers, and interact directly with your DNA. And here's what's really keeping researchers up at night. Nanoplastics are so small that they can trigger inflammatory responses at the cellular level. Your immune system recognizes these particles as foreign invaders and mounts an attack. But unlike bacteria or viruses, plastic particles can't be broken down or eliminated by your immune system. So your body keeps fighting them, creating a state of chronic inflammation that can persist for years or even decades. Chronic inflammation has been linked to virtually every major disease affecting humans today. Cancer, heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, autoimmune disorders. The list goes on and on. And now researchers are beginning to investigate whether the chronic inflammatory response triggered by microplastics might be contributing to the rise in these diseases. But here's what makes this situation truly unprecedented. Every previous environmental health crisis in human history, from lead poisoning to asbestos exposure, affected specific populations or occurred in specific locations. Factory workers, people living near industrial sites, communities with contaminated water supplies. There was always some way to identify who was at risk and potentially limit exposure. Microplastics are different. They're everywhere, affecting everyone, regardless of where you live, what you do for work, or how careful you are about avoiding plastic products. You could live in the most remote location on Earth, grow all your own food, and filter all your water, and you would still be exposed to microplastics through the air you breathe. And the exposure is only increasing. Global plastic production has doubled every 15 years since the 1950s. We're now producing over 400 million tons of plastic waste annually, and much of it ends up in the environment, where it slowly breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces. The microplastics that are entering your body today were likely part of plastic products that were manufactured decades ago, and they'll continue circulating through the environment long after you're gone. This is where the comparison to asbestos becomes particularly relevant. Like asbestos, microplastics are durable, persistent, and can cause inflammation when they interact with human tissue. Like asbestos, they're ubiquitous in our built environment and extremely difficult to avoid. And like asbestos, the health effects may not become apparent until years or decades after initial exposure. But unlike asbestos, which primarily affected specific occupational groups, microplastics are affecting the entire global population simultaneously. Every person on Earth is now part of an uncontrolled experiment in chronic low-level plastic exposure, and we won't know the full results for decades to come. The research that's emerging is painting an increasingly troubling picture. Studies have linked microplastic exposure to reduced sperm count in men, altered menstrual cycles in women, and developmental delays in children. Animal studies have shown that microplastics can cause liver damage, disrupt gut bacteria, and interfere with reproduction. Some research has even suggested that microplastics might be contributing to the rise in allergies and autoimmune diseases by overstimulating our immune systems. And we're just getting started. Most of this research has emerged within just the last 5 years, as scientists have developed new techniques for detecting and measuring these incredibly small particles. Every month brings new studies revealing microplastics in places we never expected to find them, and new evidence of their potential health impacts. What's particularly concerning is that we're seeing effects at exposure levels that were previously considered safe. The assumption has always been that the dose makes the poison, that small amounts of potentially harmful substances won't cause problems. But microplastics seem to be challenging that assumption. Even tiny amounts of certain nanoplastic particles have been shown to cause cellular damage in laboratory studies. This is fundamentally changing how toxicologists think about plastic safety. For decades, the focus has been on the safety of plastic products themselves. Are plastic food containers safe? Are plastic toys safe for children? But now researchers realize they need to be asking different questions. What happens when plastic products break down? Where do those fragments go? And what do they do when they accumulate in living tissue over time? The answers to those questions are becoming clearer, and they're not reassuring. What's happening inside your body right now is something that would have been considered science fiction just a decade ago. These plastic particles aren't just sitting passively in your tissues like harmless debris. They're actively interfering with some of your body's most fundamental processes, and the mechanisms they're using are more sophisticated than anyone initially imagined. Let me walk you through exactly what happens when a nanoplastic particle enters one of your cells. It's a process that researchers are calling cellular hijacking, and it's unlike anything we've seen before. When a nanoplastic particle penetrates a cell membrane, your cell doesn't recognize what it is. Remember, plastic has only existed for about 70 years, but our cellular machinery evolved over millions of years. Your cells have sophisticated systems for dealing with bacteria, viruses, toxins, and other threats they might encounter in nature. But they have no evolutionary programming for dealing with synthetic polymer fragments. So what happens? Your cell tries to process these particles using its existing systems, and that's where things start to go wrong. The particle gets engulfed by cellular structures called lysosomes, which are like the cell's recycling centers. These organelles are designed to break down waste products and foreign materials using powerful enzymes. But plastic doesn't break down the way organic materials do. Instead, the plastic particle just sits there, taking up space and resources. The lysosome keeps trying to digest it, producing more and more enzymes, becoming increasingly stressed. Eventually, these lysosomes can become so overloaded that they start to malfunction or even burst, releasing their toxic contents directly into the cell. But that's just the beginning. Some nanoplastic particles are so small that they can slip past the lysosomes entirely and interact directly with your cell's most critical components. They can bind to proteins, interfere with enzyme function, and even interact with your DNA. Recent studies have shown that certain types of nanoplastics can actually insert themselves between DNA strands, potentially causing mutations or interfering with gene expression. Think about that for a moment. Plastic particles that started out as someone's water bottle or shopping bag could end up altering the genetic instructions in your cells. And here's where it gets really disturbing. Your cells have repair mechanisms designed to fix DNA damage, but these systems evolved to deal with natural forms of damage, like radiation or chemical exposure. They don't know how to handle plastic particles that are physically embedded in the DNA structure, so the damage can persist and potentially be passed on when the cell divides. This cellular level interference helps explain some of the puzzling health trends we've been seeing over the past few decades. Fertility rates have been declining in developed countries worldwide. Sperm counts in men have dropped by over 50% since the 1970s. The age of puberty in girls has been steadily decreasing. Rates of certain cancers, particularly hormone-related cancers, have been increasing in younger populations. Now, correlation isn't causation, and these trends have multiple contributing factors. But the timing is striking. Many of these health changes began appearing in the 1980s and 1990s, which is exactly when you'd expect to start seeing the effects of widespread microplastic exposure that began in the 1950s and 60s. But let's get even more specific about what researchers are discovering. In 2023, a groundbreaking study examined the reproductive organs of young men who had died in accidents. What they found was shocking. Every single sample contained microplastics, and the concentration was highest in the men who had the lowest sperm counts. The researchers found that certain types of plastic particles seem to cluster around sperm-producing cells, potentially interfering with the delicate hormonal signals that control reproduction. They also discovered that men with higher microplastic levels had elevated markers of inflammation in their reproductive tissues. Similar patterns are emerging in women's health research. Studies have found microplastics in ovarian tissue, and preliminary research suggests they might be interfering with egg development and hormone production. Some researchers are now investigating whether microplastic exposure could be contributing to the rising rates of polycystic ovary syndrome and other reproductive disorders. But reproduction is just one system that's being affected. Your gut, which houses about 70% of your immune system, is turning out to be particularly vulnerable to microplastic damage. When you consume microplastics through food and water, many of them end up in your digestive tract. Your intestinal lining is designed to be selectively permeable, allowing nutrients to pass through while keeping harmful substances out. But microplastics can disrupt this delicate balance. Studies have shown that microplastic exposure can increase intestinal permeability, a condition sometimes called leaky gut. When your gut lining becomes more permeable, substances that should stay in your digestive tract can leak into your bloodstream, potentially triggering inflammatory responses throughout your body. Even more concerning, microplastics seem to be altering the composition of gut bacteria. Your microbiome plays a crucial role in everything from digestion to immune function to mental health. Research has shown that people with higher microplastic exposure have different bacterial populations in their guts, often with fewer beneficial bacteria and more potentially harmful ones. This microbiome disruption might help explain some of the mysterious health issues that have been on the rise. Inflammatory bowel diseases, food allergies, autoimmune conditions, and even certain mental health disorders have all been linked to gut microbiome imbalances. And then there's your brain. The discovery of microplastics in brain tissue was particularly alarming because the blood-brain barrier is supposed to be impenetrable to most foreign substances. The fact that plastic particles can cross this barrier suggests they might be causing neurological effects that we're only beginning to understand. Animal studies have shown that microplastic exposure can cause behavioral changes, memory problems, and signs of neuroinflammation. Some research has even suggested that microplastics might be contributing to neurodegenerative diseases by promoting the formation of protein clumps that are characteristic of conditions like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Now, I want to be clear about something. Most of this research is still in its early stages, and scientists are being appropriately cautious about drawing definitive conclusions. We don't yet have long-term human studies showing direct causal relationships between microplastic exposure and specific diseases. That kind of research takes decades to complete. But here's what's deeply troubling about our situation. We're not waiting for the research to be complete before continuing to increase our exposure. Every day, more plastic enters the environment. Every day, more of it breaks down into microplastics. Every day, the concentration of these particles in our air, water, and food continues to rise. By the time we have definitive proof of harm, it may be too late to prevent it. We could be looking at a situation where an entire generation of humans has been exposed to levels of microplastics that cause significant health problems, but we won't know for sure until those problems start showing up in large numbers. This is what scientists call a natural experiment, except it's not natural, and the entire human population is the test subject. We're conducting a real-time study of chronic microplastic exposure on a planetary scale, and we won't know the results until it's too late to change them. The plastic industry, predictably, has been downplaying these concerns. They point out that the research is still preliminary, that correlation doesn't prove causation, that plastic products have been safely used for decades. They fund studies that focus on the benefits of plastic while minimizing research into potential harms. But here's what they're not telling you. Internal industry documents that have come to light through legal proceedings show that plastic manufacturers have been aware of the potential for their products to break down and contaminate the environment for decades. They've known that microplastics could pose health risks, but they've chosen to prioritize profits over public health. Sound familiar? It's the same playbook that was used by the tobacco industry, the asbestos industry, and the fossil fuel industry. Manufacture doubt, fund contradictory research, delay regulation, and keep selling your product until you're forced to stop. But this time, the stakes are even higher because the contamination is global and irreversible. Once plastic breaks down into microplastics, there's no way to remove it from the environment. These particles will continue circulating through our air, water, and food systems for centuries or even millennia. And the exposure is only going to get worse. Current projections suggest that the amount of plastic in the environment will quadruple by 2040. That means the microplastic exposure that you're experiencing today is just a fraction of what future generations will face. Think about your children or grandchildren. They're going to grow up in a world where microplastic exposure is even more ubiquitous than it is today. They'll be consuming plastic particles from the moment they're conceived, and those particles will accumulate in their tissues throughout their entire lives. What will the long-term health consequences be for a generation that has been exposed to microplastics from birth? We simply don't know, but the early indicators are deeply concerning. Studies of children who have grown up during the microplastic era are showing some troubling patterns. Rates of asthma and allergies have skyrocketed. Attention deficit disorders are more common than ever before. Childhood cancers, while still rare, are occurring at higher rates than in previous generations. Again, these trends have multiple causes, and we can't definitively blame microplastics for all of them. But the timing and the biological mechanisms we're discovering make it impossible to ignore the potential connection. What's particularly insidious about microplastic exposure is that it's cumulative. Unlike many toxins that your body can metabolize and eliminate, plastic particles tend to accumulate over time. The microplastics you're exposed to today will likely still be in your body decades from now, potentially causing ongoing inflammation and cellular damage. This means that even if we could magically stop all microplastic pollution tomorrow, people who have already been exposed would continue to face health risks for the rest of their lives. And those who have been exposed since childhood or even before birth might face the greatest risks of all. The scope of this contamination becomes even more staggering when you realize that microplastics aren't just coming from obvious sources like plastic bottles and bags. They're being generated by activities and products that most people would never suspect. Every time you wash synthetic clothing, thousands of microscopic fibers break off and flow down the drain. Your washing machine is essentially a microplastic generator, releasing up to 700,000 plastic fibers per load into wastewater systems. These fibers are too small for most treatment plants to filter out, so they end up in rivers, lakes, and eventually the ocean, where they enter the food chain. But it gets worse. Those same synthetic fibers are also being released into the air inside your home every time you wear polyester, nylon, or other synthetic fabrics. Recent studies have found that indoor air contains significantly higher concentrations of microplastics than outdoor air, and much of it comes from textile fibers floating around your living space. Think about that the next time you're folding laundry or getting dressed. You're literally breathing in plastic particles that are shedding from your clothes. Car tires are another massive source that most people never consider. Every time you drive, tiny particles of synthetic rubber wear off your tires and become airborne. These tire particles make up a significant portion of the microplastics found in urban air, and they're particularly toxic because they contain a cocktail of chemicals, including heavy metals and carcinogenic compounds. Studies have shown that people living near busy roads have higher concentrations of tire-derived microplastics in their blood. But even if you don't live near a highway, these particles can travel for miles on wind currents, meaning rural areas aren't immune from tire pollution. Then there are the sources hiding in plain sight in your kitchen. Tea bags made from plastic release billions of microplastic particles when you steep them in hot water. A single plastic tea bag can release 11.6 billion microplastic particles into your cup. That's not a typo. Billion with a B. Bottled water, which many people choose thinking it's safer than tap water, often contains higher concentrations of microplastics than municipal water supplies. The plastic bottles themselves leach particles, especially when they're exposed to heat or sunlight. That bottle of water sitting in your hot car isn't just warm, it's literally dissolving into the water you're about to drink. Food packaging is another major culprit. Plastic containers, especially when heated in microwaves, release microplastics directly into food. But even foods that aren't stored in plastic can be contaminated. Fruits and vegetables can absorb microplastics from contaminated soil and irrigation water. The particles actually get taken up by plant roots and transported throughout the entire plant, meaning they can't be washed off. Seafood is particularly problematic because marine animals consume microplastics directly from seawater, and these particles accumulate in their tissues. When you eat fish, shellfish, or other seafood, you're consuming all the plastic particles that animal ingested during its lifetime. Shellfish like mussels and oysters are especially concerning because they're filter feeders that concentrate microplastics from the water around them. But here's what's really disturbing about the sources of microplastic exposure. Many of them are so deeply embedded in modern life that avoiding them would require completely restructuring how we live. Synthetic clothing, car transportation, food packaging, bottled water. These aren't luxury items that people can easily give up. They're necessities in the modern world. This systemic nature of microplastic contamination means that individual actions, while important, can only do so much to reduce exposure. You could make every possible lifestyle change to minimize your plastic use, and you'd still be consuming plastic particles because they're now part of the basic infrastructure of human civilization. The psychological impact of this realization can be overwhelming. Many people, when they first learn about the pervasiveness of microplastic contamination, go through a process similar to the stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and eventually some form of acceptance. The denial phase often involves looking for reasons why the research might be wrong or overstated. People want to believe that the problem isn't as serious as scientists are suggesting, or that it only affects certain populations or geographic areas. The anger phase typically focuses on the industries that created this mess. Why weren't we warned? Why are companies still allowed to produce products that break down into environmental contaminants? Why isn't the government doing more to protect us? The bargaining phase involves frantically searching for ways to avoid exposure. People buy expensive water filters, switch to all natural products, and try to eliminate plastic from their homes. While these actions can reduce exposure somewhat, the reality is that microplastics are so ubiquitous that complete avoidance is impossible. The depression phase hits when people realize the full scope of the problem. The contamination is global, irreversible, and affects everyone regardless of their lifestyle choices. It can feel hopeless, like humanity has fundamentally altered the planet in ways we can't undo. But here's where we need to be careful not to fall into despair, because that's exactly what prevents us from taking meaningful action. Yes, the problem is enormous and unprecedented. Yes, we're all exposed, whether we like it or not. But that doesn't mean we're powerless. The research that's emerging isn't just documenting the problem, it's also revealing potential solutions and interventions that could reduce the health impacts of microplastic exposure. Scientists are discovering that certain nutrients and compounds can help protect cells from microplastic damage. Antioxidants, for instance, appear to reduce the inflammatory response triggered by plastic particles. Omega-3 fatty acids may help maintain cell membrane integrity, making it harder for nanoplastics to penetrate cells. Some research suggests that specific probiotics can help restore gut microbiome balance even in the presence of microplastics. Other studies are investigating whether certain foods or supplements can help the body eliminate plastic particles more effectively. There's even promising research into medical treatments that could help people who have already accumulated significant amounts of microplastics in their tissues. Scientists are working on developing therapies that could help clear plastic particles from the bloodstream and organs, though these treatments are still in early experimental stages. But perhaps more importantly, awareness of the microplastic crisis is driving innovation in materials science and manufacturing. Companies are developing new types of biodegradable plastics that break down into harmless compounds rather than persistent microplastics. Others are creating closed-loop recycling systems that prevent plastic waste from entering the environment in the first place. Some of the most exciting developments are happening in the realm of plastic alternatives. Researchers are creating packaging materials from seaweed, mushroom fibers, and other organic materials that provide the same functionality as plastic without the long-term environmental and health consequences. The textile industry is also responding to concerns about synthetic fiber pollution. New types of natural and semi-synthetic fibers are being developed that don't shed microplastics when washed. Some companies are even creating synthetic fabrics with special coatings that prevent fiber loss. But the solutions that show the most promise are those that address the problem at its source. Extended producer responsibility laws are being implemented in various countries, requiring manufacturers to take responsibility for the entire life cycle of their products, including what happens when they break down. Some jurisdictions are banning certain types of single-use plastics entirely. Others are implementing deposit systems that incentivize proper recycling and reuse. Carbon taxes and other economic instruments are being used to make plastic production more expensive, encouraging companies to find alternatives. International cooperation is also increasing. The United Nations is working on a global treaty to address plastic pollution, similar to the agreements that have been successful in addressing ozone depletion and other environmental problems. But here's the critical point that often gets lost in discussions about solutions. The window for preventing the worst impacts of microplastic contamination is rapidly closing. The plastic that's already in the environment will continue breaking down for decades or centuries, regardless of what we do today. This means that even if we implemented perfect solutions tomorrow, completely stopping all new plastic pollution, microplastic concentrations in the environment would continue to increase for years to come. The plastic products manufactured in the 1980s and 1990s are just now breaking down into the microplastics that are entering our bodies today. What we're dealing with isn't just an environmental problem that we can solve with better technology or policies. It's a legacy contamination issue that will affect human health for generations, regardless of the actions we take now. This reality fundamentally changes how we need to think about the problem. Instead of focusing solely on prevention, we also need to invest heavily in understanding and treating the health impacts of microplastic exposure. We need to develop better diagnostic tools for measuring microplastic levels in human tissues. We need to understand which types of plastic particles are most harmful and why. We need to identify vulnerable populations who might be at higher risk for microplastic-related health problems. Most importantly, we need to start thinking about microplastic exposure as a chronic health condition that requires ongoing medical management, similar to how we approach other environmental health issues like lead exposure or air pollution. This shift in thinking has profound implications for healthcare systems around the world. If microplastics are indeed contributing to rising rates of inflammatory diseases, reproductive disorders, and other health problems, then addressing microplastic exposure could become one of the most important public health initiatives of the 21st century. But it also raises difficult questions about responsibility and justice. The people who are most exposed to microplastics aren't necessarily the ones who contributed most to creating the problem. Low-income communities often face higher exposures due to their proximity to waste sites, industrial facilities, and busy roads. Children and developing fetuses, who have no choice in their exposure levels, may face the greatest long-term health risks. Future generations will inherit a contaminated planet that they had no role in creating. This intergenerational aspect of the microplastic crisis adds an ethical dimension that goes beyond simple environmental or health policy. We're making decisions today that will affect the health and well-being of people who haven't even been born yet. And unlike previous environmental health crises, there's no clear endpoint to microplastic contamination. Lead can be removed from paint and gasoline. Asbestos can be contained or eliminated from buildings. DDT can be banned and will eventually break down in the environment. But plastic is designed to be durable and persistent. The microplastics that are entering your body today will likely still be circulating through the environment long after human civilization as we know it has ended. In many ways, microplastics represent the ultimate expression of humanity's impact on the planet. We've created materials that are so durable and so widely distributed that they've become part of the geological record. Future scientists studying Earth's history will be able to identify the beginning of the plastic age by looking at sediment layers that contain microplastic particles. We've fundamentally altered the chemistry of the planet's surface, and now that alteration is coming back to alter us. The plastic that was supposed to make our lives more convenient and comfortable has become an unwelcome permanent resident in our bodies. The question now isn't whether microplastics are affecting human health. The evidence for that is becoming overwhelming. The question is how severe those effects will prove to be, and whether we can develop effective ways to minimize the damage that's already been done. What we're learning about microplastics is forcing us to confront some uncomfortable truths about the relationship between technological progress and human well-being. For decades, we've operated under the assumption that if a technology provides clear benefits, any potential risks are worth taking. But microplastics challenge that calculus. The benefits of plastic are undeniable, but the costs are turning out to be far higher than anyone anticipated. And unlike most technological risks, which affect specific groups or can be managed through regulation, microplastic contamination affects everyone and appears to be largely irreversible. This raises profound questions about how we evaluate new technologies and materials. How do we balance immediate benefits against long-term risks that we may not fully understand for decades? How do we make decisions about planetary scale interventions when the consequences might not become apparent until it's too late to change course? The microplastic crisis is teaching us that our current systems for assessing technological risk are fundamentally inadequate. We're making decisions about materials and products based on short-term studies and limited data, then deploying them globally before we understand their full implications. And once these technologies are embedded in our economic and social systems, they become incredibly difficult to change, even when evidence of harm starts to emerge. The plastic industry today has hundreds of billions of dollars invested in current production methods and supply chains. Even if perfect alternatives existed, the transition would be enormously expensive and disruptive. This creates a kind of technological lock-in, where we continue using potentially harmful technologies, not because they're the best available options, but because the costs of switching to alternatives seem too high. But as the health costs of microplastic exposure become clearer, that calculation may start to change. The economic burden of treating microplastic-related health problems could eventually exceed the costs of transitioning to safer alternatives. Some economists are already trying to quantify these hidden costs of plastic production. They're looking at healthcare expenses, lost productivity, environmental cleanup costs, and other factors that don't show up in the price of plastic products, but represent real costs to society. When these external costs are factored in, plastic suddenly becomes much more expensive than it appears on the surface, and alternatives that seem too costly when compared to cheap plastic start to look much more economically attractive. This kind of full cost accounting is essential for making rational decisions about materials and technologies. But it requires us to think beyond the immediate costs and benefits to consider the long-term implications for human health and environmental sustainability. The microplastic crisis is also highlighting the importance of the precautionary principle in technology assessment. This principle suggests that when dealing with potentially serious or irreversible harm, lack of complete scientific certainty shouldn't be used as a reason to postpone action. In other words, we don't need to wait for absolute proof that microplastics cause specific health problems before taking steps to reduce exposure. The preliminary evidence is concerning enough to warrant preventive action, especially given that the consequences of waiting could be irreversible. But implementing the precautionary principle requires overcoming powerful economic and political interests that benefit from the status quo. The plastic industry has enormous influence over policy-making processes, and they have strong incentives to delay or prevent regulations that could affect their profits. This dynamic plays out in regulatory agencies around the world, where industry influence often outweighs scientific evidence in policy decisions. Scientists can present compelling research about microplastic risks, but if that research threatens profitable industries, it often gets sidelined or ignored. Breaking through this institutional inertia requires not just good science, but also public awareness and political pressure. People need to understand the scope and seriousness of the microplastic crisis before they'll demand action from their elected representatives. And that's where individual awareness and education become critically important. Every person who understands the microplastic problem becomes a potential advocate for solutions. Every conversation about microplastics raises awareness and builds political support for addressing the crisis. The research I've been sharing with you represents the work of thousands of scientists around the world who are dedicating their careers to understanding and addressing this problem. But their work only matters if it reaches the people who can act on it. That includes policymakers who can implement regulations, business leaders who can develop alternatives, and individual consumers who can make informed choices about the products they buy and use. It also includes healthcare providers who need to understand how microplastic exposure might be affecting their patients' health. Many doctors and nurses have never heard of microplastics, let alone considered how they might be contributing to the health problems they see in their practice. As awareness grows and research continues, we're likely to see microplastic exposure become a routine part of medical assessments, similar to how healthcare providers now ask about smoking history, alcohol use, and other environmental exposures. We might also see the development of new medical specialties focused on environmental health and toxic exposure. Just as we now have specialists who treat lead poisoning or asbestos-related diseases, we may soon have doctors who specialize in microplastic-related health problems. But regardless of how the medical community responds, the reality remains that we're all living through the early stages of a global health experiment whose outcome won't be known for decades. The children being born today will be the first generation to live their entire lives in a world saturated with microplastics. They'll be our canaries in the coal mine, showing us through their health outcomes what chronic lifetime exposure to plastic particles really does to the human body. And that's a responsibility that should weigh heavily on all of us. Every decision we make about plastic production, consumption, and disposal is potentially affecting the health of people who haven't even been born yet. The microplastic crisis isn't just an environmental issue or a health issue. It's a moral issue about the kind of world we're leaving for future generations. And the clock is ticking. Every day that passes without meaningful action is another day of increasing contamination, another step toward health impacts that may prove irreversible. The question isn't whether we should act, but whether we'll act quickly enough to prevent the worst outcomes. And that depends not just on scientists and policymakers, but on all of us understanding the urgency of this crisis and demanding the changes that are needed to address it. Because right now, as you're finishing this video, those plastic particles are still circulating through your bloodstream, still triggering inflammatory responses in your tissues, still accumulating in your organs. And with every breath you take, every meal you eat, and every glass of water you drink, more are joining them. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Now let me tell you about something that researchers are calling the contamination multiplication effect, and it's going to fundamentally change how you think about exposure levels. You might assume that if microplastics are everywhere, at least the concentrations would be relatively consistent. Maybe you'd get a steady, predictable dose that your body could potentially adapt to over time. But that's not what's happening. Instead, scientists are discovering that microplastic exposure follows what they call contamination hotspots and amplification events that can suddenly spike your exposure to levels hundreds or thousands of times higher than baseline. Let me paint you a picture of what I mean. Dr. Jennifer Martinez at UC San Diego has been tracking microplastic levels in human subjects over extended periods, and what she found was shocking. Most of the time, people maintain relatively low background levels of plastic particles in their blood, but then, seemingly out of nowhere, those levels would skyrocket for days or weeks at a time. At first, the research team thought their equipment was malfunctioning. How could someone's microplastic load increase by 300% overnight and then stay elevated for 2 weeks? But as they tracked more subjects, they realized these weren't measurement errors. They were real exposure events that seemed to correlate with specific activities or environmental conditions. The breakthrough came when they started correlating the exposure spikes with detailed activity logs. What they discovered was that certain combinations of factors could create perfect storms of microplastic exposure that overwhelm the body's natural clearance mechanisms. For example, they found that people who exercised outdoors on high pollution days while wearing synthetic athletic wear could absorb massive amounts of plastic particles through their lungs and skin simultaneously. The increased breathing rate during exercise meant they were pulling more contaminated air deep into their lung tissue, while the friction from synthetic clothing was generating clouds of microfibers that they were directly inhaling. But it gets worse. The synthetic athletic wear wasn't just generating particles, it was also creating static charges that attracted airborne microplastics like a magnet. People were essentially turning themselves into walking plastic particle collectors every time they went for a run in polyester shorts and a synthetic jersey. The research team started calling these amplification cascades, where multiple sources of exposure combine and reinforce each other to create exposure levels far higher than you'd predict by simply adding up individual sources. Another major amplification event they identified was indoor air during winter months. When people close up their homes and turn on heating systems, microplastic concentrations can increase dramatically. Forced air heating systems circulate dust that's loaded with plastic particles from synthetic carpets, furniture, and clothing. Meanwhile, the dry indoor air creates static conditions that keep particles suspended longer than they would be in more humid environments. The researchers found that people living in homes with synthetic carpeting, polyester furniture, and forced air heating could have indoor microplastic exposure levels 20 times higher than outdoor levels, even in heavily polluted urban areas. But perhaps the most disturbing amplification effect involves what happens during common household activities. Vacuuming with conventional vacuum cleaners, for instance, can create temporary clouds of microplastic particles that take hours to settle. The vacuum's brush action breaks down carpet fibers and upholstery, while the exhaust air carries the finest particles back into the room. Folding laundry made from synthetic fabrics can release massive amounts of microfibers into the air. The mechanical action of folding and sorting clothes generates static electricity that breaks textile bonds, creating clouds of particles too small to see, but perfectly sized to penetrate deep into lung tissue. Even opening packages can create exposure spikes. The plastic packaging materials, especially foam padding and bubble wrap, shed particles when handled. But the real problem comes from packages that have been in transit for weeks or months, bouncing around in trucks and warehouses. By the time they reach your door, the packaging has been mechanically stressed to the point where it's actively shedding microplastics. Dr. Martinez's team documented one case where a person's blood microplastic levels increased by 400% after spending an afternoon unpacking a large shipment of items wrapped in bubble wrap and foam padding. The exposure was so severe that elevated levels persisted for nearly a month. These amplification events help explain why some people seem to be more affected by microplastic exposure than others, even when they live in the same area and have similar lifestyles. It's not just about total cumulative exposure, it's about peak exposure events that can overwhelm cellular defense mechanisms. Think of it like the difference between standing in light rain for hours versus getting caught in a sudden downpour. Your body has systems for dealing with steady, low-level exposure to foreign particles. But when those systems get overwhelmed by sudden high-dose exposures, that's when the most severe cellular damage occurs. And here's what makes this particularly insidious. Most people have no idea when they're experiencing high exposure events. Unlike chemical spills or obvious pollution, microplastic contamination is completely invisible. You could be breathing in massive amounts of plastic particles and feel perfectly fine, at least initially. The health effects often don't show up until days, weeks, or even months later, making it nearly impossible for people to connect their symptoms to specific exposure events. That persistent cough that developed after you spent the weekend organizing your closet full of synthetic clothes. The digestive issues that started after you moved into that new apartment with wall-to-wall synthetic carpeting. The fatigue that began after you started that new exercise routine in synthetic workout gear. Most people, and even most doctors, would never consider microplastic exposure as a potential cause for these kinds of symptoms. But the research suggests these connections may be more common than anyone realizes. Dr. Martinez has started working with physicians to develop what she calls exposure history protocols that ask patients about activities and environments that could lead to microplastic amplification events. The preliminary results are revealing some striking patterns. Patients with unexplained respiratory symptoms often report high exposure to synthetic textiles or live in environments with synthetic carpeting. Those with mysterious digestive issues frequently have histories of high consumption of packaged foods or bottled water. People with persistent fatigue and inflammation markers often work in environments with high levels of airborne particles or live near major roadways. Now, correlation isn't causation, and these are preliminary observations. But the patterns are consistent enough that some forward-thinking physicians are starting to include microplastic exposure in their differential diagnoses for certain types of chronic health problems. But let's dig deeper into what happens during these high exposure events at the cellular level, because this is where the research gets truly disturbing. When your body is suddenly flooded with microplastic particles, your immune system goes into overdrive. Immune cells, called macrophages, rush to engulf and eliminate the foreign particles. But plastic doesn't break down the way organic materials do. Instead, the macrophages become overloaded with plastic particles they can't digest. These plastic-loaded macrophages start releasing inflammatory signals, calling for backup from other immune cells. But when those reinforcements arrive, they encounter the same problem. They can engulf the plastic particles, but they can't break them down or eliminate them. Eventually, you end up with large numbers of immune cells that are essentially disabled by their plastic cargo. They're still alive, but they can't perform their normal functions because they're too busy trying to deal with indigestible plastic particles. This creates what researchers call immune exhaustion, where your body's defense systems become less effective at dealing with real threats like bacteria, viruses, or cancer cells. Some studies suggest that people with high microplastic loads may be more susceptible to infections and have higher rates of certain cancers, though this research is still in early stages. But the immune dysfunction goes beyond just overloaded macrophages. The inflammatory signals released by plastic-laden immune cells can trigger autoimmune responses, where your body starts attacking its own tissues. This might help explain the rising rates of autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, and multiple sclerosis. The timing is certainly suggestive. Many autoimmune diseases have become more common since the 1980s, which is exactly when you would expect to start seeing the effects of widespread microplastic exposure that began in the 1960s and 70s. And the amplification effects I mentioned earlier could explain why some people develop autoimmune diseases while others don't, even when they have similar genetic predispositions. Those peak exposure events might be the trigger that pushes a primed immune system over the edge into autoimmunity. Your cells have sophisticated systems for maintaining their internal environment and repairing damage. These quality control systems evolved over millions of years to deal with natural threats, but they're being overwhelmed by synthetic materials they were never designed to handle. When microplastic particles interfere with cellular quality control, the effects can be subtle at first but devastating over time. Cells start accumulating damaged proteins and dysfunctional organelles. Their energy production systems become less efficient. Their ability to repair DNA damage is compromised. This cellular deterioration happens gradually, which is why the health effects of microplastic exposure often don't show up immediately. You might feel fine for months or years while your cells are slowly being damaged at the molecular level. But eventually, the accumulated damage reaches a tipping point where cellular function starts to fail. This could manifest as cancer if DNA repair systems are overwhelmed. It could show up as neurodegeneration if brain cells can't maintain their complex structures. It could appear as organ failure if critical tissues lose their ability to function. The insidious nature of this process means that by the time symptoms appear, significant irreversible damage may have already occurred. And because the damage accumulates slowly over time, it's extremely difficult to trace back to specific exposure events or sources. This is why some researchers are calling microplastics a stealth toxin. Unlike acute poisoning, where cause and effect are obvious, microplastic toxicity operates on timescales that make it nearly impossible to establish clear causal relationships using traditional epidemiological methods. But there's emerging evidence from animal studies that's helping scientists understand what chronic microplastic exposure might do to human health over decades. These studies are particularly valuable because researchers can control exposure levels and track health outcomes over entire lifespans. The results are deeply troubling. Animals exposed to human-relevant levels of microplastics show accelerated aging, increased cancer rates, reproductive dysfunction, and neurological problems. Their lifespans are shortened, and they develop age-related diseases earlier than unexposed animals. One particularly disturbing study followed mice exposed to microplastics from birth through their entire lives. By middle age, these animals showed signs of premature aging, including grey fur, reduced activity, and age-related diseases that normally don't appear until much later in life. When researchers examined their tissues, they found extensive cellular damage and inflammation throughout their organs. The microplastic-exposed animals had cellular aging markers typically seen in much older animals, suggesting that chronic plastic exposure was literally accelerating the aging process at the molecular level. If similar effects occur in humans, we could be looking at a generation of people who age prematurely and develop age-related diseases decades earlier than previous generations. This would have profound implications, not just for individual health, but for healthcare systems, social security programs, and society as a whole. But perhaps the most chilling finding from animal research involves transgenerational effects. Studies have shown that microplastic exposure can cause genetic and epigenetic changes that are passed on to offspring. Animals whose parents were exposed to microplastics show health problems even if they themselves are never directly exposed to plastic particles. These effects can persist for multiple generations, meaning that the microplastic exposure happening today could affect the health of your great-grandchildren. The mechanisms behind these transgenerational effects are still being studied, but they appear to involve changes in gene expression patterns that are inherited along with DNA. Essentially, microplastic exposure is leaving molecular scars that can be passed down through generations. This adds an entirely new dimension to the microplastic crisis. We're not just dealing with the health effects of current exposure, but potentially with genetic damage that could affect human health for centuries to come. And remember, these animal studies are using exposure levels that are considered representative of current human exposure. We're not talking about unrealistically high doses that would never occur in real-world conditions. These are the kinds of microplastic concentrations that people are already experiencing today. The implications are staggering. If the animal research translates to humans, we could be looking at a future where chronic diseases appear earlier, lifespans are shortened, and genetic damage accumulates across generations. But animal studies, while valuable, don't tell us everything about human health effects. That's why researchers are desperately trying to develop better methods for studying microplastic exposure in human populations. The challenge is that everyone is exposed, so there are no true control groups. Unlike studies of smoking or chemical exposure, where you can compare exposed and unexposed populations, microplastic research has to look for patterns within universally exposed populations. Some of the most innovative research is taking advantage of what scientists call natural experiments, where different populations have different exposure levels due to circumstances beyond their control. For example, researchers are studying people who live in areas with different types of water treatment systems. Some treatment plants are better at filtering out microplastics than others, creating populations with relatively higher or lower exposure levels. Other studies are comparing people who work in different occupations. Textile workers, for instance, have much higher exposure to synthetic fibers than office workers. Outdoor labourers in urban areas breathe more tire particles than people who work indoors. These natural experiments are providing some of the first direct evidence of microplastic health effects in humans. The preliminary results are consistent with what animal studies have predicted, showing associations between higher microplastic exposure and increased rates of inflammatory diseases, respiratory problems, and reproductive dysfunction. But even these studies face significant limitations. Microplastic exposure is so complex and variable that it's extremely difficult to tease out specific cause and effect relationships. People with high occupational exposure might also have different diets, lifestyles, or genetic backgrounds that could influence their health outcomes. This uncertainty creates a perfect environment for industries to manufacture doubt about microplastic health risks. They can always point to limitations in the research, argue that correlation doesn't prove causation, and demand more studies before any regulatory action is taken. It's a familiar playbook that's been used successfully to delay action on tobacco, asbestos, lead, and other environmental health hazards. But in the case of microplastics, the stakes are even higher because the contamination is global and irreversible. Every year that passes without meaningful action is another year of increasing exposure for the entire human population. Children being born today will face microplastic exposure levels that are significantly higher than what their parents experienced, and their children will face even higher levels still. We're conducting a real-time experiment on human health at a planetary scale, and we won't know the full results until it's too late to change the outcome. But there's another aspect of this crisis that makes it particularly challenging to address: the sheer complexity of the global plastic system. Plastic isn't just one material, it's a vast family of different polymers, each with different properties and different breakdown patterns. Some plastics are relatively stable and break down slowly. Others degrade rapidly under certain conditions. Some release toxic additives as they break down, while others are relatively inert. This means that not all microplastics are equally dangerous. The health effects depend on the specific type of plastic, how it was processed, what additives it contains, and what environmental contaminants it has absorbed during its breakdown process. But here's the problem. When you're exposed to microplastics in real-world conditions, you're not getting a single, well-characterized type of plastic particle. You're getting a complex mixture of different plastic types, sizes, shapes, and chemical compositions, all at the same time. Your body has to deal with polyethylene particles from shopping bags, polystyrene fragments from food containers, polyester fibers from clothing, tire rubber particles from roadways, and dozens of other plastic types simultaneously. Each type might have different toxic effects, and those effects might interact with each other in unpredictable ways. This cocktail effect makes it almost impossible to predict the health consequences of real-world microplastic exposure based on laboratory studies of individual plastic types. It's like trying to understand the effects of a complex pharmaceutical mixture by studying each ingredient separately, and the mixture is constantly changing. New types of plastics are being developed and deployed all the time. Old plastic products are breaking down and contributing new types of particles to the environment. The chemical composition of microplastics in the environment is evolving continuously. This means that even if we could perfectly understand the health effects of current microplastic exposure, that knowledge might not apply to future exposure patterns. We're not just dealing with a static contamination problem, but with a dynamic, evolving system that's becoming more complex over time. The global nature of plastic production and trade adds another layer of complexity. A plastic bottle manufactured in China using additives sourced from India might end up as microplastic particles in the water supply of a small town in Nebraska. The plastic chair you bought at a furniture store could contain flame retardants that were banned in your country, but are still legal where the chair was manufactured. This global supply chain makes it nearly impossible for individual countries or regions to control their population's exposure to microplastic-related chemicals. Even if your government implements strict regulations on plastic additives, you could still be exposed to those same chemicals through imported products or through microplastics that have traveled through international air and water currents. The atmospheric transport of microplastics is particularly concerning. These particles can travel thousands of miles on wind currents, meaning that plastic pollution generated in one part of the world can end up affecting people on the other side of the planet. Scientists have found microplastics in some of the most remote locations on Earth, including Antarctic ice, mountain lakes in the Himalayas, and islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. There's literally no place on the planet that's free from plastic contamination. This global dispersion means that even if we could somehow eliminate all plastic production tomorrow, the microplastics that are already in the environment would continue circulating and breaking down for decades or centuries to come. We've created a form of pollution that's essentially permanent on human timescales. The plastic particles that are entering your body today will likely still be in the environment long after your great-great-grandchildren are gone. This permanence fundamentally changes how we need to think about environmental health policy. Previous pollution problems could be addressed by cleaning up contaminated sites or stopping the source of contamination. But microplastics can't be cleaned up in any meaningful way, and stopping new plastic production wouldn't eliminate exposure from existing contamination. Instead, we need to start thinking about adaptation strategies. How do we protect human health in a world where microplastic exposure is unavoidable? How do we minimize the health impacts of contamination that we can't eliminate? Some researchers are exploring medical interventions that could help people cope with chronic microplastic exposure. These might include supplements that support cellular repair mechanisms, treatments that help the immune system deal with plastic particles, or therapies that could help clear accumulated particles from tissues. Others are investigating whether certain lifestyle factors might influence susceptibility to microplastic toxicity. Could exercise help your body eliminate plastic particles more effectively? Might certain diets provide protection against plastic-induced inflammation? Could stress reduction techniques help mitigate the health impacts of unavoidable exposure? These questions are becoming increasingly important as it becomes clear that complete avoidance of microplastic exposure is impossible. We need strategies for living with contamination, not just preventing it. But adaptation strategies also raise difficult ethical and social justice questions. If certain interventions can reduce microplastic health risks, who will have access to them? Will microplastic protection become another form of healthcare inequality? Where wealthy people can afford treatments that poor people cannot, the communities that are most heavily exposed to microplastics are often the same communities that have limited access to healthcare and other resources. Low-income neighborhoods tend to be located near highways, industrial sites, and waste facilities that generate high levels of airborne particles. These communities often have older housing with synthetic materials that shed more microplastics than newer, higher quality alternatives. If microplastic-related health problems become more severe over time, these disparities could worsen existing health inequalities in profound ways. The people who contributed least to creating the plastic pollution problem could end up suffering the most from its health consequences. This environmental justice dimension of the microplastic crisis adds urgency to finding solutions that don't just protect some people, but that address the systemic nature of the contamination problem. And that brings us back to the fundamental question of how we got into this situation in the first place, and what it tells us about how we evaluate new technologies and materials. The story of how microplastics became ubiquitous in our environment is really a story about how we make decisions about new technologies when we don't fully understand their long-term consequences, and it's a pattern that keeps repeating itself throughout human history. In the 1950s, when plastic production was ramping up dramatically, the focus was entirely on the immediate benefits these materials could provide. Plastics were lightweight, durable, versatile, and cheap to produce. They could replace more expensive materials like glass, metal, and wood in countless applications. They promised to make life more convenient and affordable for millions of people. But there was virtually no research into what would happen to these materials over decades or centuries. The assumption was that durability was purely a benefit. Nobody was asking what would happen when durable materials eventually started breaking down in the environment. Nobody was studying whether microscopic fragments of synthetic polymers might pose health risks if they ended up inside living organisms. The regulatory framework that existed at the time was designed to evaluate the safety of chemical substances, not physical materials that could fragment into particles. Agencies tested whether plastic products themselves were safe to use, but they didn't consider what would happen when those products reached the end of their useful life and began to degrade. This regulatory blind spot wasn't unique to plastics. It reflects a broader pattern in how societies evaluate new technologies. We tend to focus on immediate, obvious benefits while overlooking potential long-term, systemic consequences that might not become apparent for decades. The same pattern played out with leaded gasoline, which provided clear engine performance benefits, but caused widespread lead poisoning. It happened with chlorofluorocarbons, which were excellent refrigerants but depleted the ozone layer. It's happening now with various emerging technologies that promise significant benefits, but whose long-term consequences remain largely unknown. Each time, the industries promoting these technologies argue that the benefits are proven, while the risks are speculative. They fund studies that emphasize the positive aspects while minimizing research into potential harms. They use uncertainty as a reason to delay precautionary measures until definitive proof of harm emerges. But by the time that proof becomes available, the technology has usually become so embedded in economic and social systems that changing course becomes enormously difficult and expensive. Entire industries develop around the new technology, creating powerful interests that resist change even when evidence of harm starts to accumulate. This is exactly what's happening with microplastics today. The plastic industry has hundreds of billions of dollars invested in current production methods. Millions of jobs depend on plastic manufacturing and processing. Countless other industries rely on plastic materials for their operations. Even if perfect alternatives to current plastics existed and were available today, the transition would be massively disruptive to the global economy. The resistance to change isn't just about corporate greed, though that's certainly part of it. It's also about the practical challenges of reorganizing complex systems that have developed around specific technologies. But the microplastic crisis is forcing us to confront an uncomfortable truth about this pattern of technological adoption. The long-term costs of some technologies can be so high that they outweigh even substantial short-term benefits. And when those costs are irreversible or affect future generations who had no say in the original decisions, the ethical implications become profound. We're essentially making choices today that will determine the health and environmental conditions that our children and grandchildren will live with. And we're making those choices based on incomplete information, under pressure from commercial interests, and with inadequate consideration of long-term consequences. The challenge is that we can't simply stop developing and deploying new technologies. Innovation is essential for addressing major global challenges like climate change, disease, and poverty. But we need better ways of evaluating and managing the risks associated with new technologies before they become globally ubiquitous. Some scientists are calling for what they term anticipatory governance of emerging technologies. This would involve studying potential long-term consequences much more thoroughly before widespread deployment, implementing monitoring systems to track effects over time, and maintaining the flexibility to change course if problems emerge. But anticipatory governance requires overcoming powerful economic and political incentives that favor rapid deployment of profitable technologies. It also requires accepting that some beneficial technologies might need to be delayed or modified if they pose unacceptable long-term risks. The microplastic crisis could serve as a catalyst for developing better approaches to technology assessment and governance. The scope and severity of the problem are forcing policymakers, scientists, and business leaders to grapple with questions about technological risk management that previous generations could afford to ignore. But the urgency of addressing current microplastic contamination shouldn't distract us from the deeper systemic issues that allowed this problem to develop in the first place. If we only focus on cleaning up the current mess without changing how we evaluate new technologies, we're likely to find ourselves dealing with similar crises in the future. The next generation of materials and technologies is already being developed in laboratories and research facilities around the world. Nanotechnology, synthetic biology, artificial intelligence, and other emerging fields promise revolutionary benefits, but also pose potential risks that we're only beginning to understand. Will we repeat the same mistakes that led to the microplastic crisis? Or will we learn from this experience and develop better ways of managing technological risks before they become global problems? The answer to that question may determine not just the health of future generations, but the long-term viability of human civilization on this planet. As I've been researching this topic over the past 3 years, I've been struck by how many of the scientists studying microplastics express a sense of frustration and urgency that goes beyond normal academic concerns. They're not just worried about publishing papers or advancing their careers. They're genuinely frightened by what they're discovering, and they're frustrated by how slowly society is responding to evidence of serious harm. Dr. Sarah Chen at Stanford, who has been studying microplastics in drinking water, told me that she sometimes feels like she's shouting into the void. Her research shows clear evidence that microplastic concentrations in tap water are increasing year over year, and that certain types of plastic particles can cause cellular damage at concentrations commonly found in municipal water supplies. But when she presents these findings to water utility managers, she often encounters skepticism or resignation. Some dismiss the research as preliminary. Others acknowledge the problem but claim they lack the technology or funding to address it. Many seem overwhelmed by the scope of the challenge and unsure where to begin. This disconnect between scientific understanding and practical action is playing out in laboratories and government agencies around the world. Researchers are documenting serious risks, but the institutions responsible for protecting public health often seem paralyzed by the complexity of the problem. Part of the challenge is that microplastic contamination doesn't fit neatly into existing regulatory frameworks. Traditional environmental regulations focus on controlling specific pollution sources or limiting releases of particular chemicals. But microplastics come from countless diffuse sources and include hundreds of different chemical compositions. Water treatment plants can install expensive filtration systems that remove some microplastics, but not all types and sizes. Air quality regulations can limit certain types of particulate emissions, but they weren't designed to address the microscopic fibers shed by synthetic textiles or the particles generated by tire wear. Food safety agencies can set limits on chemical contaminants in food products, but they don't have established protocols for measuring or regulating physical contamination by plastic particles. This regulatory fragmentation means that addressing microplastic contamination requires coordination across multiple agencies and levels of government. But such coordination is difficult to achieve, especially when the scientific understanding of health risks is still evolving. Meanwhile, the contamination continues to increase. Every day that passes without comprehensive action is another day of growing exposure for everyone on the planet. The psychological impact of this situation on the scientists studying it is profound. Many of them became researchers because they wanted to contribute to human knowledge and help solve important problems. But they're finding themselves in the position of documenting a crisis that society seems unable or unwilling to address effectively. Some have told me they struggle with feelings of helplessness and despair. They know that the microplastic problem will get worse before it gets better, regardless of what actions are taken today. They're watching contamination levels increase in real time while feeling powerless to stop it. Others channel their frustration into advocacy, working to raise public awareness and push for policy changes. But this puts them in the uncomfortable position of being both scientists and activists, roles that don't always fit together easily. The scientific community has traditionally valued objectivity and restraint in public communications. Researchers are trained to qualify their findings, acknowledge limitations, and avoid overstating conclusions. But when dealing with problems that have urgent public health implications, this measured approach can seem inadequate. How do you communicate the seriousness of a global contamination crisis without appearing alarmist? How do you advocate for precautionary action based on preliminary evidence without compromising scientific credibility? These tensions are playing out in academic journals, professional conferences, and media interviews as scientists struggle to find the right balance between scientific rigor and public engagement. But regardless of how they choose to communicate their findings, the research continues to accumulate, and the picture it's painting becomes more concerning with each new study. Just last month, a team of researchers published findings that have sent shockwaves through the scientific community studying microplastics. They discovered that certain nanoplastic particles can actually alter gene expression in human cells within hours of exposure. The study exposed human cells to concentrations of plastic nanoparticles similar to what people might encounter through normal daily activities. Within 6 hours, the researchers observed changes in the activity of genes involved in inflammation, cellular repair, and immune function. Even more disturbing, some of these genetic changes persisted even after the plastic particles were removed from the cell cultures. The exposure had created lasting alterations in how the cells functioned, suggesting that even brief encounters with nanoplastics could have long-term consequences. If these findings hold up under further scrutiny, they could revolutionize our understanding of how microplastic exposure affects human health. Instead of thinking about plastic particles as relatively inert foreign objects that cause problems mainly through physical irritation, we might need to consider them as active agents that can reprogram cellular function. The implications are staggering. If nanoplastics can alter gene expression in human cells, they could potentially influence virtually every aspect of human biology. Metabolism, immune function, neurological development, reproductive health, aging processes. All of these could be affected by exposure to plastic particles that are too small to see, but powerful enough to change how our genes work. And remember, this study used exposure levels that represent normal, everyday contact with plastic particles. We're not talking about extreme contamination scenarios or occupational exposures. These are the kinds of nanoplastic concentrations that everyone is experiencing simply by living in the modern world. We've reached the end of this investigation, but the reality is that this story is far from over. Right now, as you finish watching this video, those plastic particles are still there, still accumulating, still interfering with your body's most fundamental processes. The research I've shared with you represents just the beginning of our understanding of what may be the defining health crisis of our time. Share this information, demand answers from policymakers, and remember that every choice you make about plastic use matters, not just for you, but for generations yet to come. The question isn't whether microplastics are changing us. The question is whether we'll act fast enough to limit how much they change our future. I hope you had an amazing time with me here at Boring Science. I will see you tomorrow as always. Until then, stay curious, keep wondering. This is Boring Science signing off. Cheers.